My name is Joshua McGeehee. I'm a senior and next Gen Science major. I'll be introducing our speaker for the night. Daniel M. Kimmel is past president of the Boston Society of Film Critics and the founding co-chair of Boston Online Film Critics Association. Mr. Kimmel has taught film and media courses at Suffolk University, Emerson College, and Boston University. His reviews appeared in the Worcester Telegram and Gazette for many years and can now be found at northshoremovies.net. He writes on Jewish film for the Jewish Advocate and on science fiction films for sci-fi-moviepage.com and Space and Time magazine. He was nominated for a Hugo Award for the book Jar Jar Binks Must Die and Other Observations About Science Fiction Movies. His most recent book is his first novel, Shh, It's a Secret, a novel about aliens, Hollywood, and the Bartender's Guide. He is also the author of I'll Have What She's Having, the behind the scenes of great romantic comedies. Please welcome Daniel M. Kimmel.
Okay, since first they're videoing this, I think I could take this off. I know who I am. I have to thank you for that lovely introduction. I do have to make one correction on behalf of those of us living in Massachusetts. It's Worcester, not Worcester. We do that just to fool the outsiders. Okay, let's see. I like that some people laughed at Jar Jar Binks Must Die. That's how I can tell who wants to read that book. It's a collection of my essays on science fiction movies, and I divide the world into two groups. There are the people who get it, and you should be getting the book and reading it. And then there were the people like my mother who go, "That's very nice, dear. What does it mean?" Ask me afterwards, I'll explain. All right, now, before I get started, I have to say, when I got the invitation, I was not familiar with Hillsdale College, and I did a little research on it because I wanted to make sure that the person writing to me was not the same person who writes to me every week promising me there's money in a Nigerian bank account. And I found that, hey, yeah, it's a real place, and I saw some of the speakers who have come here for the, I understand you do like 3 or 4 of these a year, but for the film programs, Peter Bogdanovich and Richard Schickel and Robert Osborne, I'm going, wow, I am honored to be included in that pantheon. Thank you very much for having me here. I've been treated very well. And I do have to say, because I've been speaking to some of the administrators here, and my bias is always sort of like against college administration as faculty and student. But I have to tell you, you students, if you're complaining about the food in the cafeteria, you people are insane. I had brunch today. If they fed me as an undergraduate like that, I never would have left. I would have stayed there, really. The food here is excellent. All right. Let's talk about romantic comedies. When it comes to film genre, some genres get more respect than others. When I started teaching at Suffolk, which is in downtown Boston, and they wanted me to teach a film genre class, and I said, I would love to do a class on science fiction films. But if I do that, the first thing here, they're going to think I'm crazy. So I did something safe. I did the gangster film, and which is a wonderful genre to study, because if you follow the gangster films from the 30s through the 50s, the Godfather of the 70s, the 90s, you can see how the genre develops, how it reflects the time. And this is true of any genre. As it evolves, it's telling you something about the time when the films are made, as well as something about the genre. Well, there were some genres that got a lot of respect. The gangster film, the Western, film noir, and I've taught them all, and I love them all. But these are genres that are not only popular with the public, they get an unending stream of critical essays and academic treatises. They get a lot of respect. There are 2 genres that I also champion, though they don't get universal respect, although they're treated very differently. No one has to make the case for the science fiction film with the public. The public loves science fiction movies. Of the top 20 box office films in the United States. 19 of them are science fiction or fantasy. The only one that is not is Titanic. Yeah, okay, we're going to pretend that it's actually the true story. And then now, just for some of you older people in the audience, that's not taking inflation into account. Hard to believe, but this is a fact. If you do it in constant dollars, so that you're counting the dollar for each film so that it's equal, Gone with the Wind is still the most successful movie of all time. Yeah, Gone with the Wind, yeah. Boy, this is an easy crowd to get applause from. All right, Casablanca, yeah! All right. Okay. Now, unfortunately, science fiction films do not get a lot of respect from critics and scholars whose role it is to assess what films are worthy. In fact, in my book, Jar Jar Binks Must Die, my opening essay is science fiction, the forbidden genre. And if you want to do a CCA on science fiction films, I'd love to come back and I'll defend science fiction movies. But that's not our topic tonight. But I will mention, if you have me back, you got to speak to me about when it's scheduled, because this is my holy season. This is Oscar night. I have my DVR going on back in Somerville, Massachusetts, so that I can catch what I'm missing right now. All my critic buddies are getting together for a party, and I said, well, I'm going to be in Michigan giving a lecture. This year is unusual, though, in one of the films that could win some awards tonight, Gravity, could win in some major categories. Now, you watch. If it does, I guarantee there will be articles that point out it's not really a science fiction film, because it's good. But again, that's okay, no more on science fiction, because the other genre is our focus for the evening, and that's the romantic comedy. Here you can find shelves of books on the subject, including my own, which I understand will be for sale after this, and I will be happy to sign, and I can sign it to you or to dear eBay customer, whichever you prefer. And you can take courses on the romantic comedy. You can attend symposia like this. There's no difficulty getting serious film scholars to talk about this very beloved genre. However, if you talk to the public, and now I'm talking especially to the students here, because the target audience for Hollywood is that 18 to 25 demographic, and I'm willing to bet that if you talk, especially to the guys in the room, about romantic comedy, within minutes you're going to hear, oh, those are chick flicks. And that's the problem, is that romantic comedies nowadays tend to get dismissed as, oh, it's for girls, it's for women, it's chick flicks. The way some people will dismiss certain romantic dramas as, oh, those are weepies. Those are three handkerchief movies. Those, we don't have to take them seriously. And the blame for this, I argue, is Hollywood, because they seem to have forgotten how to make good romantic comedies. Something that they used to do with ease. In the heyday of the screwball comedy of the 1930s, which I'll talk to in just a moment, even lesser entries, even minor romantic comedies, and most the older people in the audience are the ones who have Turner Classic Movies will recognize these titles, and the rest of you will go, what is he talking about? But movies like Easy Living and Ball of Fire were entertaining and worth seeing. They're not masterpieces, they're not great films, but they're fun. What's more, they were films that were meant to appeal to both men and women, because after all, whoever the object of your affections is, nearly all of us would like to have some love and romance in our lives. So it's not like, oh, romance, that's just for girls. Really? That's a surprise to me. Love stories with comic elements are as old as the Bible. Take a look at the book of Esther sometime and try to imagine what a Howard Hawks or a Billy Wilder might have done with that story. Last year, Joss Whedon, creator of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and writer and director of The Avengers, offered up a new version of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. I guess he didn't know that you were doing it here this year. But he did. In fact, I was at a science fiction convention last March where they asked me to MC what they call the trailer park, where I'm showing trailers of upcoming movies, and we're showing science fiction and horror and fantasy, and the trailer came out for Much Ado About Nothing, and the person editing the package together, I said, stick it in there. I know it doesn't fit, put it in anyway. And when it came up and people realized it was Joss Whedon's version of this Shakespeare play, the place went wild. It's a lovely, funny, charming film, and it brought Shakespeare to people who might not have thought they would like it. As long as people continue to fall in love, there are going to be romantic comedies. Now, given that in about a half hour or so, I have to cover about a century of romantic comedy movies, I better get to it. Now, I'm going to skip over the silent period. That's the other thing I want to talk to anybody who invites me back here. Let's talk about the movies you select. Those of you who went to see City Lights this afternoon, it is a masterpiece. It is a brilliant film. I've taught the film. It's worth seeing, right? I don't know how many of you were at the dinner when they said City Lights. Yay! Just like Gone with the Wind in Casablanca. But I have trouble calling it a romantic comedy. To me, it's a movie about Charlie Chaplin, the tramp, and the love story is sort of, a subplot. It's there. I'm not denying it's there, but to me, the focus of it is not the romance, and so that I have trouble calling that a romantic comedy. For me, romantic comedies as we know it really begin with the talkies. By the way, just as a footnote on City Lights, City Lights was released in 1931, and those of you who know when The Jazz Singer came out, the first talkie was 1927. By 1931, all movies were talkies except for City Lights. And 5 years later, Chaplin did Modern Times, which was another silent movie. Chaplin didn't make his first talkie until The Great Dictator in 1940, and he got away with it because he was Charlie Chaplin. And the public just, whatever Chaplin wants to do. Chaplin, for his part, said, oh, talkies, they're just a passing fad. Well, he was a genius, but he didn't know everything. The 1930s may include, when you study American history, they include Prohibition and the Great Depression. But for those of us who were studying the romantic comedy, the 1930s are a golden age. When I was doing my book, which spans basically from the 30s to the present, I said I did it deliberately because I could have done the whole book just on the 30s. There are so many great romantic comedies in the 1930s, it's ridiculous. Part of it, no doubt, was because people went to the movies like never before or since. There was no television, there was no internet, you had radio, but many of the radio programs were doing things that were either adapting things that were movies or it was going in the other direction. If you've ever seen a Woody Allen movie called Purple Rose of Cairo, you get a good sense of how movies offered an escape from the problems of the real world, which is why many of those stories involve one or more characters who is wealthy. You might be counting your pennies at home, but you could lose yourself in fantasies of opulence and glamour, plus a newsreel and some cartoons, once or twice a week. People went regularly to the movies. It wasn't like, oh, we haven't been to the movies in a while, what's playing? It's the local theater had a new double feature maybe every 3 or 4 days, and there were a lot of theaters, and you went to the movies. The dividing line for looking at movies from the 1930s, all of them, not just romantic comedies, is 1934. Now, why 1934? Prior to that, there were depictions of sex and violence that would soon become unthinkable in the movies. I'll give you a couple of examples. In the movie 42nd Street, the musical, Ginger Rogers shows up for a tryout, and somebody says, "Oh, look, it's Anytime Annie." The only time she ever said no, she hadn't heard the question. The year before, director Ernst Lubitsch did a movie called Trouble in Paradise. Lubitsch was a master of sly but tasteful innuendo. And in Trouble in Paradise, he has two jewel thieves seduce each other by picking each other's pockets while they're having dinner together. Later, he wants to imply, really, there was a limit to what he could do, but he wanted to imply that one of the jewel thieves is having a sexual relationship with the woman who runs this perfume company. And so what he does is he has them embrace, and we see their shadows fall across a bed. Very tasteful, very subtle. And if you look at these what they call pre-code movies, you can sometimes be quite surprised at what pops up. 1934 is the first year of the production code. And it goes into effect, and the studios agreed to a regime of self-censorship. Basically, they were worried that if they didn't do it, the government was going to do it for them. There was a lot of local censorship around the country. There were groups, the Catholic Legion of Decency was one, but there were many groups that Hollywood needs to be cleaned up. Who are these people who are telling these terrible stories? You think they got this out of Plato's Republic or something? Let's see who was doing their reading in philosophy class. There was a real issue about cleaning up Hollywood, and so Hollywood decided we're going to clean up ourselves. I'll give you one example of the mindset that was going on at the time. In A Night at the Opera, the Marx Brothers movie, Groucho Marx and Margaret Dumont are getting off an ocean liner. Margaret, if you don't know the Marx Brothers movies, Margaret Dumont was the dowager, this heavy-set woman who appeared as their foil in a lot of the films. And they're getting off the ocean liner, and she says, "Do you have everything?" And Groucho turns back with a leer, "Well, I haven't had any complaints yet." That line was considered so racy that even though this is 1935, it had been approved by the Production Code Office, several cities and states ordered that bit of dialogue be snipped from the film before the film would be approved for local showing. The studios feared losing power to a national censorship board, ordered by the federal government, and that was why they created this self-policing thing to fend them off. It wasn't, as a kind of a footnote to this, it wasn't until 1950 that the Supreme Court ruled that the movies are covered by the First Amendment. Up until that time, the idea that the First Amendment protected movies was not at all settled in the law. Well, anyway, under the new production code, couples could not appear in bed together, even if the characters were married. Crime always had to be punished. Adultery could never be rewarded. And there were all sorts of other rules that applied. And there's a whole lecture we could do on what happened under the production code, but you just need to know it's there. Directors like Frank Capra and Leo McCarey had no choice but to accept the code. But instead of making watered-down versions of the stories they wanted to tell, they took it as a challenge. They would show that the eternal dance of courtship could still be entertaining without giving offense. Sometimes they had to be very clever. I was talking last night with some people. We talked about The Awful Truth. The Awful Truth, Cary Grant and Irene Dunne are this couple that at the start of the movie, their marriage breaks up and they're going to get divorced. And what happens is, of course, we know in the audience that they really got to get back together. And so what's going on in the rest of the film is first, Irene Dunne gets a boyfriend, and Cary Grant busts that up, and then he gets a girlfriend, and she busts that up, and they realize that they really belong together. And at the end of the movie, they're in this cabin where they vacation together, and we know they're going to bed together, and the last shot of the movie is the clocks, as a cuckoo clock striking midnight, and you see the two figures come out of the cuckoo clock, and they go back in the clock together. Well, the thing is, their divorce becomes final at midnight. We know they're going to get married again, but this is how Leo McCarey figured out how to get an unmarried couple in bed together under the production code. You don't see anything, of course, because that would be tasteless, but he managed to set up a story that was so clever that it went right over the head of the production code, and they approved it, and the movie was a big hit. Now, It Happened One Night is the prototype for generations of romantic comedies. Just out of curiosity, how many people here have seen It Happened One Night? Oh, okay. The rest of you, that's on your homework list. That's the movie they should have been showing here. You need to see It Happen One Night. It is one of the greatest romantic comedies, and you'll sit there and go, oh, wow, every romantic comedy I've ever seen does this, except they did it first. The premise is Claudette Colbert is an heiress, and before the film has started, she has married this playboy aviator over the objections of her father. And her father is now holding her prisoner on his yacht until she comes to her senses. Well, she's a headstrong heiress, as only 1930s screwball comedies could provide us with, and she jumps off the ship and escapes and begins this madcap journey to New York. Along the way, she meets a reporter played by Clark Gable. And I have to give a delightful footnote here because it's Oscar night. Clark Gable was, at that point, a star at MGM. He was a leading man at MGM, and he was being punished by being loaned out to Columbia Pictures, which was just barely Poverty Row. So this was punishment that he had to do this movie. And he knew it was punishment, and he showed up for his first meeting with Frank Capra drunk. And Capra decided to use that for his character in the movie. Gable ended up having so much fun making this movie, and the movie turned out to such a success. He won an Oscar. Claudette Colbert won an Oscar. The screenwriter won an Oscar. Capra won an Oscar, and it won Best Picture. It was the first film to sweep the top Oscars. So it was punishment for Clark Gable, and so he took his Oscar home and was chastised properly. Now, all right, so back to the movie. She's sheltered and pampered. He's a man of the people. And along the trip from Florida to New York, they will each have something they need to learn from the other. And to me, this is a key element to the romantic comedy. She gets to see how people are struggling during the Depression. They're traveling by bus. They go to a motor court. She sees how the people live, and she sees how insulated she's been. In one scene, she gets off a bus and she tells the bus driver, "Oh, I may be a little delayed. You'll wait for me." And she's stunned when she comes back and the bus is left without her, because she's used to telling the chauffeur to wait. Now, Gable, though, is full of himself. He's a reporter who everything he's talking about, he says, I should write a book about that. In the most famous scene in the film, they're hitchhiking, and he says, let me show you all the ways to hitchhike. I should write a book about this. And he does this thing where you do the thumb this way, you do it this way. He's doing all these different things, and the cars are just zipping by. And finally she goes, I'll stop a car, and I won't use my thumb. And she goes to the edge of the road, and she hikes up her skirt to show off her leg, and the car comes screeching to a halt. And Gable says, why didn't you take all your clothes off? You could have stopped a fleet of cars. And she said, I'll remember that if we ever need a fleet of cars. And so basically, they both needed to learn from each other. In this case, he needs to learn, don't be so full of yourself. You don't know everything. She has something to teach him, even though he thinks, oh, you're just some airy twit. And she's got stuff to learn as well. And this exchange becomes a key element of the romantic comedy. In many of the best romantic comedies, the central couple consists of two people who each need to learn something from each other. And it's a formula we can see in movies as different as Pretty Woman and When Harry Met Sally. It's the same formula, and what makes the films distinctive is the characters and the situations. I mentioned The Awful Truth in terms of the subtlety of the sex. Let me tell you what Frank Capra did, and it happened one night. They have to spend the night together in a motel room. They're not married. A good woman in 1934 is not going to spend the night, with another man. She goes, "Thank you very much. I'm on my way." And he goes, "No. He has no designs in her." And what he does, and this was another famous bit from the movie, he puts a rope up in the motel room and hangs a blanket from it. "It's the walls of Jericho," he tells her, "and nothing is going to bring it down, and so she is perfectly safe." And that's how they get through the night. Well, I'm going to spoil the movie for you. At the very end, they get married. And the last scene of the movie is the head of the motor court where they're now staying, talking to his wife, and he goes, "Strangest thing, that couple, they asked for a rope, a blanket, and a bugle." And the wife... And the wife goes, "Are they married?" He says, "Oh yeah, they showed me the certificate, they're real." And the last shot of the movie, you don't even see Gable and Colbert. You see the blanket hanging from the rope, you hear the blast of the trumpet, and the blanket comes down. When I would show this to my classes, I would go, "What has just happened?" And they didn't always volunteer it. I said, what this movie is celebrating is the couple, consummating the marriage. Again, it's by being so subtle and so clever, Capra isn't violating the production code, and yet he's making it very clear that if two people are in love and they get married, this is the natural outcome of events. Another key element of romantic comedies is the bantering. Since filmmakers could no longer show or even very clearly imply the sex, attraction and seduction occurs with words. In movies like It Happened One Night in The Awful Truth, Bringing Up Baby, Holiday, My Man Godfrey, Nothing Sacred, part of the fun of the film is listening to the dialogue. In fact, My Man Godfrey has what I consider one of the best lines of dialogue. I wish they would write dialogue like this today. There's a charity scavenger hunt going on, and Eugene Pallett, nobody knows who Eugene Pallett is. You ever see Errol Flynn's The Adventures of Robin Hood? He's Friar Tuck. Okay, so there's a little froggy guy, and he's the father, and somebody says to him, "This place is a madhouse." And he goes, "Well, all you need for an asylum is 4 walls and the right kind of people." So in My Man Godfrey, Carol Lombard is his daughter and another ditzy heiress, and she finds Godfrey, who is played by William Powell, Godfrey is a bum. She literally finds him on a trash heap. And she needs him because on her scavenger hunt list, she needs to find a, quote, forgotten man, unquote. This is 1936. This is the depths of the Depression. It's very pointed. And right from the start, we see how they're going to affect each other through the words they use. Godfrey asks, what is the scavenger hunt? And she explains what this is about. They have to find these things, and then whatever money they raise is going to charity. But oddly enough, there never seems to be any money left over to give to charity. And she says, I've decided I don't want to play any more games with human beings as objects. It's kind of sordid when you think of it. And she then asks him, "So why are you choosing to live at a dump?" Quite honestly, she's asking, "Why are you choosing to live here?" And he says, "Well, my real estate agent thought it would be good for my asthma." The sarcasm is totally lost on her, but it sets the tone. She's ditzy, but she's capable of moral education. She sees there's something wrong in this, and she ends up hiring Godfrey to be her butler. And that's the premise of the movie. And meanwhile, we see he's a wise guy, very sarcastic, but as it turns out, he has a secret in his past. And he's got to own up to who he really is. So once again, there's an exchange where each will learn from the other, and they'll do it with snappy dialogue and a plot that may be contrived, but it never fails to entertain. And if you, by the way, if you decide to track down My Bad Godfrey, you want the 1936 version. There's a terrible remake of the 50s. Pretend it never happened. Now, in many ways, this period of the great romantic comedies hits its peak with a movie they're showing this week. And if you haven't seen it, you make a point of seeing it, The Philadelphia Story. Philadelphia Story is a great film with Katharine Hepburn having to choose in the end between her ex-husband, her fiancé, and a cynical reporter who has suddenly fallen in love with her. It's the last of 4 films that Hepburn and Cary Grant did together, and they probably would have done more, but for the fact that the very next year, she was paired with Spencer Tracy in Woman of the Year, and they became a great romantic couple on and off. Now, excuse me, I'm going to do my Marco Rubio impersonation. No, but I have a glass. It's the one thing I demand when I do a lecture. I said, I've got to have water up there because I get dry. All right, now, so Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy are paired in Woman of the Year, and they become this great romantic couple. And this is something that Hollywood seems to have forgotten. If you've got a couple, if you've got an actor and actress who strike sparks together on screen, get them into a good romantic comedy. You know, ever since the first Iron Man, I have been waiting for a romantic comedy starring Robert Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow. I thought the first Iron Man, they were so good together, and so what did Hollywood do? Instead of not putting them in a romantic comedy, in the subsequent Iron Man films, they have less and less to do with each other. I don't know what they're thinking. To me, one of the best romantic comedy moments of the last decade was when Downey, who's playing the millionaire industrialist Tony Stark, is telling his executive, his assistant, played by Paltrow, that he doesn't need her. He can easily do without her. And without missing a beat, she just looks at him. She goes, "Oh, yeah? What's your social security number?" Which, of course, he doesn't know. It's perfect. Perfect, and I want to see these two together in a romantic comedy because I think they would have a lot of fun together. They're not doing it. In fact, somebody was asking me at dinner tonight about who I would cast in an ideal romantic comedy today. Well, one of the actresses who I think is just superb, at doing this sort of material is Drew Barrymore. And I'm hard pressed to come up with an actor who is that good right now. Although I'm not an Adam Sandler fan. I used to tell my film students, put this down in your notes, Adam Sandler is not funny. That's a requirement for the exam. But there's something about the movies the two of them did together, and they've got a new one coming out. I haven't seen it yet. I don't know if it's any good. But if you look at The Wedding Singer, or what is it? I think it's called 50 First Dates. There's something about her that takes the edge off of him. And they have an on-screen chemistry that I can't define, but it works. The best, going back to Tracy and Hepburn, their best pairing, another movie put on your must-see list, is Adam's Rib. They play a husband and wife. They're both lawyers, and they're on opposite sides of a case. So they're arguing against each other in court and then coming home at night. And the case is about a woman who's taken a pot shot at her cheating husband. It was written by the husband and wife team of Garson Kanin and Ruth Gordon. And it shows a married couple still very much in love, but not immune to conflicts. Each character gets a moment where they get their comeuppance, and as before, they each have something to learn from the other, even after marriage. And that's why Adam's Rib, even though the classic definition of a comedy is a story that ends in a marriage, this is now after the marriage, and it's still a romantic comedy. Now, by the 1950s, the romantic comedy seemed to be dying. And I'm going to take this pause here to look at the time. Okay, we're going fine. By the 1950s, the romantic comedy seemed to be dying. There were a number of inferior remakes of the hits of the 1930s, and there was also some confusion as to how to show the idealized couple, particularly the women. Three actresses stood out in the genre, and their differences give you an idea of how confused filmmakers were in the attempt to do something fresh. Audrey Hepburn, who you'll see in Roman Holiday, was beautiful in an elegant way. She might have the common touch, as when she plays a chauffeur's daughter in Sabrina, but she could also be a convincing princess, as you'll see in Roman Holiday. Her secret was that her beauty was combined with intelligence. As Billy Wilder, who directed her in 2 films, famously quipped, "She looks like she could spell schizophrenia." On the other end of the spectrum was Marilyn Monroe. Now, although she was a lot smarter than people gave her credit for, her specialty on screen was of the sexy, dumb blonde. In Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, an elderly millionaire says to her, "Say, they told me you were stupid. You don't sound stupid to me." And she replies, "I can be smart when it's important." In one of her best roles in Some Like It Hot, Billy Wilder turns her sexy image on its head by having Tony Curtis's character pretend to have no interest in women or sex, so she ends up seducing him. Again, if you haven't seen Some Like It Hot, another one, write it down. I can't enforce it, I could just tell you. Now, in between these two women is a woman who could look chic but could also be the girl next door, and that was Doris Day. In her 3 films with Rock Hudson, as well as several more with Cary Grant, James Garner, and other stars, she played a woman who was successful on her own, who wanted to be romanced by a man who respected her as an equal. In the first Day Hudson film, Pillow Talk, Hudson's character shares a party line with her, and they're constantly fighting over his tying it up. And I'll now pause so those youngsters with smartphones can Google party line. What's a party line? All right, you can do it afterwards. When they're going to spend a weekend together, he has fallen for her, and when they meet in person, he pretends he's somebody else, not the goofball on the party line. And so when they're going to spend the weekend together, the truth comes out and she stalks off. This has led some to characterize these movies as Doris Day defending her virginity. And that led to Oscar Levant's famous wisecrack that he knew Doris Day before she was a virgin. All right, the rest of you, there'll be some laughs later. Oh, is that what he meant? Oh, all right. However, Day herself points out that the issue wasn't sex, it was respect. Her character was going to spend a weekend alone with a man who was clearly interested in her romantically, but who turned out to be a liar. And the rest of the film is about how he earns back her trust while she lets him know just how upset she is with him. Now, the 1960s and 1970s are rather dead years for the romantic comedy, although one can find the occasional good one. But it's not really until Annie Hall in 1977 that Woody Allen reinvents the genre. One thing he adds to the formula is the use of music. There had been music in romantic comedies before, but Allen started using old standards, like It Had to Be You and Seems Like Old Times, and his success led to that becoming part of the formula for many subsequent films. He also changed the dynamic back to what Chaplin had done in City Lights, because now you had a beautiful woman playing opposite the comic guy. Alan and Diane Keaton, Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan in When Harry Met Sally, Ben Stiller and Cameron Diaz in There's Something About Mary. In 10, Dudley Moore may be involved with Julie Andrews, but he's obsessing over Bo Derek. Now, one of the exceptions to the rules is probably Pretty Woman, because arguably Richard Gere is just as beautiful as Julia Roberts. You know, it's hard for us really good-looking guys. Subsequent romantic comedies follow one of two paths. We're in the home stretch now, for those of you who are wondering if you have enough paper for the rest of your notes. First were those inspired by the banter-driven romances of the past, updated to allow a new frankness now that the production code, which had been replaced by the movie rating system in 1968, it wasn't in play anymore. So examples include many of Woody Allen's comedies, like Broadway Danny Rose and Hannah and Her Sisters, as well as When Harry Met Sally. In that film, there's the famous scene in Katz's Deli in Manhattan, where Meg Ryan demonstrates how she fakes an orgasm, topped by director Rob Reiner's mother at the next table going, "I'll have what she's having." And if you ever get to New York and go to Katz's Deli, and I've done this, over the table where that scene was shot as a sign, "This is where Harry met Sally." The movie features the exchanges and bantering we've come to expect from the great romantic comedies, and for several years thereafter, Meg Ryan became America's sweetheart, although it was Tom Hanks rather than Billy Crystal with whom she would end up doing several films. Now, another practitioner of the traditional, the updated traditional romantic comedy is Richard Curtis, who wrote the scripts for Four Weddings and a Funeral and Notting Hill, and wrote and directed one of my favorites, Love Actually. These films succeeded while Hollywood was beginning to follow another path, an odd hybrid of what might be called the gross-out romantic comedy. It started with There's Something About Mary, in which no source of humor was too low to go for a laugh, from genitals getting caught in a zipper to unexpected hair gel. If you haven't seen it, I'm not going to tell you. Still, the movie had an undeniable sweetness to it, and the film was a surprise hit by appealing to several audience segments at the same time. Soon, other filmmakers rushed to see if they could outgross Mary, both on screen and at the box office. I'm a professional writer, don't try this at home. The filmmaker who had the biggest success with this was Judd Apatow, particularly in The 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up. There was no subtlety to the comedy, and the romantic pairings in the film were a stretch. Is there really anyone who sees Seth Rogen and Katherine Heigl as a couple? I mean, really. Yet these films scored, and the lesson Hollywood and moviegoers seem to have taken is that traditional romantic comedies are just for women, and that we need Steve Carell or Seth Rogen or Adam Sandler to get the guys to watch. I call this the frat boy school of romantic comedy. That's why we've been getting so many cheesy romantic comedies in recent years that have no sense of the genre. When movies like Bridesmaids have to spice things up with vomiting and a woman soiling a wedding dress, you know the genre is not doing well. Or you get something like All About Steve, where Sandra Bullock's character acts like an idiot in pursuing the TV cameraman played by Bradley Cooper. That's not romantic comedy, that's stalking. I will say after Gravity, though, Sandra, all is forgiven. Now, just as farmers are advised to give their fields a rest every so often, genres sometimes need to take a break. The gangster film, after a great period of the 30s, then a revival of the 50s, sort of like faded away a little bit, and then came back roaring with The Godfather. The science fiction film, which was big in the 1950s and kind of faded out, like every so often you get a 2001 A Space Odyssey, and then it was mostly fodder for the drive-in, until George Lucas introduced us to Star Wars. The romantic comedy isn't dead, it's just resting. Our interest in not being alone consumes a major part of our energies regardless of gender or orientation. Sometime soon, someone will come up with a fresh spin on this age-old story, and we'll see a new generation of romantic comedies. In the meantime, while we're waiting, there are some wonderful old ones just waiting for you to revisit or discover for the first time. Thank you. You were a good audience. You laughed in all the right places.
Immediately following Q&A, Mr. Kimmel will be having folks signing just outside of the auditorium for his book, I'll Have What She's Having, Behind the Scenes of the Great Romantic Comedy. And now is the question.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming, first of all. We talked a fair amount tonight about some of the different elements that make up a romantic comedy, some of these different fact points and almost formulas. Well, it seems like in recent years, formulaic rom-coms have perhaps been the bane of the genre. So what is the breakaway where you can respect those elements and that history and that legacy without caving to this formulaic approach? Where is the in-between?
First of all, I understand that the students get called on get extra credit, so you got an A. To reduce this to formula is making it sound like, oh, well, we're just like, solving a quadratic equation. Think of the gangster film. If I'm making a gangster film, especially like post-Godfather, well, there's going to be the mafia, there's going to be guns, there'll probably be a car chase, there'll be some brutal murders, there'll be a betrayal. Those are all elements we expect from a gangster film, but you can get The Godfather, you can get Goodfellas, you can get what I think is a brilliant gangster film, Donnie Brasco. They're very different movies, but they have the same formula, the same elements to it. So it's not so much that it's just A, B, C, D, just follow this. To my view, the great romantic comedies have these elements and then come up with interesting characters. So that, look at When Harry Met Sally is a great reinvention of it. Let's have, one of the characters is divorced. They've met each other several times over the years, and then they finally fall in love, as opposed to having the traditional meet cute at the beginning of the story and the romance starts. So there are all sorts of elements that you can play with, and once you know the formula and you master it, now you could subvert it and have a lot of fun. That's why I want these filmmakers to know the genre. There was a film that I didn't mention with Julia Roberts called My Best Friend's Wedding, that if you haven't seen, it's a charming film. She and this guy friend from college said, if neither of us are married at 30, we'll marry each other. And they're about to hit 30, and she goes, well, I guess I'm going to be marrying him, and she gets an invitation to his wedding. And now she goes to bust up the wedding because this is the guy who's supposed to be marrying her. And in the traditional romantic comedy, the third parties, what we used to, in the 40s, they would call the Ralph Bellamy role, or the 30s and 40s, the one that the character thinks she or he is ending up with, but we know, forget it, that's not meant to be. Well, in this case, the bride-to-be is Cameron Diaz, who is not only beautiful, but she is so sweet. It's not that, she's not like really evil. No, she's not. She is wonderful. And you keep waiting, well, what is Julia Roberts going to do? Well, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but the movie subverts your expectations from having seen these other romantic comedies. I think that's using the formula the right way. Another question.
So this question comes from a senior citizen, but 50 years
Really,
from
I would have said sophomore year.
So 50 years from now, not necessarily about romantic comedies, but films in general, 50 years from now, will there be the affection, the looking back at the movies made today, as, again, we senior citizens look at the movies made in the 30s, 40s, 50s? Are films part of the culture, that there's an affection for them that will be everlasting? Robert Osborne, whoever his et cetera.
Right. It's a fair question, and because I speak to senior groups and to college, I speak to a whole range of people. The college students I have to convince to watch old movies, and the older audiences I have to convince that there are movies worth seeing now. And my answer, my pat answer, which I think will go right to your point, is that we tend to have a very selective view of the past. Because, yes, you look at the movies now, I mean, the obvious question movie critics got to ask is, why do you write so many bad reviews? Don't you like movies? No. The answer is, if you have to see everything that comes out, you see a lot of junk. So when you're looking back at the past, the example I always give is Humphrey Bogart. Great star. I love Bogart. Casablanca. To be, to have and have not. The African Queen. The Big Sleep. The Maltese Falcon, right? All great, great movies. Tell me, have you seen Return of Dr. X? Humphrey Bogart plays a vampire in it. It's his worst film. We forget that film. And in fact, I was telling the people at dinner tonight, I've seen it, so you don't have to. But that's it. I think we have this, and this is humanity. This is human nature going back to the dawn of time. The past is always a golden age, and we don't live up to it now. So yeah, 50, 100 years from now, I don't know if I could predict what movies will stand the test of time, because there are, like for example, I was talking with some people about 1938, Katharine Hepburn did A Holiday and Bringing Up Baby, which I consider two of her best films, and they're considered classics. When they came out, they both failed. Katharine Hepburn was labeled box office poison, and she went back to New York thinking her movie career was over. So over time, it's hard to say what's going to stand the test of time. Would you believe that in the year of High Noon and Singing in the Rain, the Oscar for Best Picture went to The Greatest Show on Earth? Really, how many of you have seen The Greatest Show on Earth? Yeah, really. Nobody calls that one of the greatest movies ever made now. So, tastes change, but yes, I think there are movies that'll stand the test of time. I'm leaving it up to the people with the microphones. So, okay.
I'm a fan of the screwball comedy, and like Cary Grant,
okay.
Bringing Up Baby. Okay, good example.
Yep.
One of the things that I noticed about that style of movie in the 30s, but maybe I'm wrong, is that the humor is absolute. It's not topical. You look at Woody Allen in Annie Hall, where he drags Marshall McLuhan out of a crowd to rebut a guy standing in a line. That's topical. My son never understood why that was funny. But he can
I was
look.
in college when that came out. I knew why it was funny.
Yeah, but see, the golden age to me is the humor isn't topical, or was it topical in those days?
It depends. I remember studying Shakespeare in college, and there's some stuff that you needed footnotes to understand because the references were common knowledge at the time and not well known today. Certainly, you try to watch an old Bob Hope comedy, filled with topical references. Yes, the worst thing that can happen to a movie is datedness. I would say that Annie Hall is probably dated less, although quick story, I love Annie Hall. It's my favorite movie. And I would show it to my students, and there was a period of time I stopped because they weren't getting the jokes. Like there's a scene, Woody Allen and Diane Keaton are in Central Park, and he's making fun of people walking by. This is how they're bonding. They're just kind of laughing at the characters walking by. And at one point he goes, "Oh, look, it's the winner of the Truman Capote look-alike contest." And it's Truman Capote. Well, for the longest time, they didn't know who Truman Capote was. Then Philip Seymour Hoffman, of blessed memory, wins an Oscar for playing Capote, and they all knew who he was again. So it's hard sometimes. There's I suspect that some of his other movies, say Manhattan or Hannah and Her Sisters, may hold up better. But Annie Hall still has a special place in my heart. Okay.
This will be our final question.
And I'm sticking around. I'm not flying out of here till tomorrow morning, so if you want to talk to me afterwards, I'll be happy to. Because there are a lot of students who need extra credit.
I must say that my wife and I find that our favorite romantic comedy is Adam's Rib. We love it.
Yes.
It's a wonderful play back and forth. However, last night I was watching another movie that really seems very close plot-wise, and that is Mr. and Mrs. Smith with Matt Damon and Angelina Jolie. The only difference is their profession.
Brad Pitt.
Or Brad Pitt, yeah. But really, the only difference is their profession. Instead of being, attorneys, they're paid assassins. But does that go along the same lines?
Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn never had a shootout.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So, you could take an idea and run in a very different direction. I find Adam's Rib, one of the amazing things of Adam's Rib is just how modern it seems. You watch it now, and it's hard to believe that came out in 1949. That it seems a very contemporary film. In fact, the one thing that dates it a little bit is Spencer Tracy gay baiting David Wayne. David Wayne plays this composer who lives across the hall from them, and he's always making fun of Tracy and sucking up to Katharine Hepburn. And one day he goes to Tracy, needling Tracy. He goes, "I thought Amanda was wonderful in court today. Why, she almost convinced me to become a woman myself." And as he walks out, Tracy mutters under his breath, "Wouldn't have far to go." And I don't know if they would get away with that line today, but notice, even in that scene, he doesn't get the last laugh because the next thing is David Wayne in the next room goes, "He can hear you, So it's like, he thought he was muttering under his breath, and in fact, he was embarrassing himself. Yeah, great, really one of the great films. One of the films I talk about in my book, which is apparently going to be for sale in the lobby. So, one of the things my current publisher likes about me is I'm a shameless self-promoter. In any case, thank you very much for having me.